Yoga philosophy is what makes yoga so transformative, and if you're lucky enough to have a teacher who puts little nuggets of yoga philosophy into their asana, their pranayama, or their meditation practices, then you're probably going to agree with that statement. But sometimes you want to know a little bit more about yoga philosophy, and that's why I'm starting this series, breaking it down bit by bit for you, starting with the 8 limbs of yoga.
Anywhere you go, give it all.
So yoga asana is only one of the 8 limbs of yoga. There are 7 other limbs, but what are the limbs, not just in their different names, but what do they actually want us to help achieve? Well, if you look at it as steps to go through, that's one way, but I prefer to think of them as things we're constantly trying to do so that we can achieve the end point of yoga, which is connecting to our chosen God or deities. One way it was described to me, which was so beautiful, is instead of thinking them as steps on a ladder, you can think of them as a Gaia. So we're constantly trying to spiral up and do them at once, but sometimes some of them will drop off, and then we spiral back down through center, and it might expand out to include all of them once more. And I think that's important. If you've ever started your practice, specifically if you've started with yoga asana, like a lot of people who are in the West do, or who are in countries influenced by the West, like me, I'm in South Africa, then you probably started with your yoga asana and then got into pranayama and maybe some meditation before you got into the other limbs of yoga without even realizing it, perhaps. But sometimes your asana practice might drop off, and you can then lean on the other limbs of yoga to make sure you are still staying within your yoga practice. And this is also important for people who might not be physically able to practice asana. Asana is not the be all and end all, it's just part of the series. And another way that we can look at the 8 limbs of yoga is a wheel. So sometimes it's called the 8 spokes of yoga because the spokes of a wheel. And then you're trying to go through them all. Now, Vinyasa yoga, which is the lineage I come from and that a lot of physical asana-based yoga comes from, is Raj yoga, which is the kingly path. It's also referred to as the 8-limbed path. So that's, again, taking us back to the limbs of yoga. So what are the 8 limbs? Well, we'll go through them one at a time. The first one is the yamas, the restraints. I like to think of them as how we treat others. And there are multiple yamas. The first one is ahimsa. Ahimsa directly translates as non-harming, but you could look at it as more than just non-harming. It's also not being aggressive. So this non-harming attitude, this attitude of not being aggressive, it applies to other humans, it applies to other beings, it also applies to other spaces, so other places in the world, and to future generations. And I think this is very important, especially the time in the world we are right now and the system that our world operates under. Almost all of our choices affect other people and other places. So if you look at just the clothes you're wearing or the meals you ate today, how did they affect other beings and other people? Did they affect other animals? Did they pollute other spaces? Were other human beings put in working situations that are to their own detriment so that you could experience what you are? And this is not to lay blame on certain people, it's just so we start thinking about it and start trying to minimize through thought, action, and habits our harm on other places. So in short, how can we start leaving as little negative impact as possible on other people and places? Not just now, but in the future. That for me is what encompasses ahimsa. Next is satya, or truthfulness. And satya or truthfulness is not just making sure that we are not telling lies, or for a lot of people not being caught out in lies. It is also being able to recognize and discern the truth. And a lot of yoga practices help us with that discernment, so we can figure out what is the truth as opposed to what we're just being told. And once we start with that discernment, we also start seeking the truth and wanting to speak the truth to light. Now, if you find yourself in a tricky situation where being honest could hurt somebody, what do? Well, there's a reason ahimsa was placed before satya. But again, through yoga and our discernment, sorry, my cat is scratching away at the notes I've written in front of me. So if you hear an annoying or disturbing sound, it's just a playing cat. So this is where the concept of like little white lies come in. And I don't particularly like the idea of using ahimsa to condone little white lies. I prefer try to think of it as there is a kind way to tell every truth. So be honest, but do it in a way that does not harm or hurt somebody else. And there's almost always a way to do that. Sometimes it just takes a little more consideration and thinking than the little white lie. The third yama is asteya, which means non-stealing. And this applies not just to material objects, but also to spaces, to time, to energy, to concepts and ideas. And we have to be really self-aware of this, especially me. I am somebody who, it's not in my heritage or my bloodline, the practice of yoga, but thankfully, yoga was opened as a practice. That does not mean people like me, who it does not come from, do not have to be very considerate and caring in how we use the practices and give as much credit as possible to the places and the people it comes from, being the Indus Valley region. And I also think the AI environment we find ourselves in is very interesting when we think of this yogic concept of asteya. Who are we stealing these pieces of information or pieces of artwork from? Did they actually give consent for their intellectual property to be included in AI? Or was it hidden in a terms or conditions somewhere? Did they have to click yes to the terms and conditions before they opted out of the product they were using to create that? There are all sorts of implications and questions we could ask. And I think yoga, for being such an ancient system of knowledge, really does help us think about modern problems. Brahmacharya, this is one of the yamas I find very interesting, and it's often looked at through a very narrow lens. That lens being people who did not come from a lineage of yoga that had to do with their ancestry, thinking it only applied to monks and celibacy. But Brahmacharya is the correct use of energy. So you could apply that at almost any situation. Are you using your energy correctly in everyday interactions? But with the sexual connotations, are you having the correct respect for your intimate relations? There is the chance that we could use intimacy to manipulate people to get what we want instead of for the sacred bond that it is. Brahmacharya reminds us of that. Aparigraha is the last of the yamas, and this, one of the translations is non-covetousness or not being greedy. And the covetousness also makes me think of not being envious of what others have. So this is about not wanting all of something for yourself or not wanting what somebody else has got for themselves. It's about not being stingy and about sharing with others. And I think it's also very important with aparigraha to think about where something comes from. The thing I think of in the English language is ill-gotten gains. Are your gains ill-gotten, or did you get them by staying on the clear and narrow, or the straight and narrow? Yes, the straight and narrow path. So those are the yamas, and next we move on to the niyamas. The second limb of niyamas is our observances, or how we treat ourselves. So the yamas dealt with different people, niyamas brings it back to ourselves. Again, there's a reason that they're in that order. I think starting with the outward and working our way in is something that works for a lot of people. And the niyamas start with saucha, which is cleanliness. And our cleanliness is not just external, but it's also internal. So that internal could translate to our thoughts. This again is why I think the yamas came first, because to have clean thoughts, we have to pass through all of those yamas and make sure they tick off. None of the resentment, none of the greed, none of the misuse of energy, none of the harm or the hurtfulness, the stealing, etc., etc. The other way it could be looked at internally is what we choose to eat. Diet culture is just full of certain words that I don't think should apply to clean, and one of them is clean eating. I don't think any type of food is particularly dirty. But there are so many qualified dietitians and nutritionists who will tell you certain foods are not good for us and processed foods are not good for us. I'm going to leave it there because that is not my skill set or knowledge set. and rather speak to the professionals on it. Then when it comes to the external, Saucha is about how we keep the outside of our body clean. It is how we keep our spaces clean, and that can also pertain to our yoga mats. The next niyama is santosha, which is our contentedness. And this, I think, is very interesting, especially with English translations and English connotations, because contentedness is not always the best connotation. We think of someone who's content with what they have, and we don't think, what a beautiful way of living. We think, oh, well, they're just happy to stay where they are. But in the yogic connotation, it is more about being happy with what you've got already, being grateful and appreciative of where you've started. So in the Sanskrit, santosha is more about being present and appreciative than about settling. And this leads us nicely into the next of the niyamas, and that is tapas. One translation of tapas is flame, one translation is discipline, another is a burning desire to practice. But tapas is about our getting onto the mat every single day. It is about wanting to continuously learn. And this is why I think contentment comes before tapas. Because if they had switched it, it would just be drive, do better, and not being happy with where we started, what we have, having that gratitude and presence. But continuously learning is a very important part of yogic philosophy. And that also leads nicely into one of our other niyamas, which is svadhyaya. So svadhyaya can be translated as self-study or as studying sacred texts. It's also continuous learning. Again, I think that is why they are put in that particular order, because we do want to continually be learning. And if you think that this means only looking at the Yoga Sutras, yes, the Yoga Sutras are a wonderful text, but it can also apply to other religious texts if you're somebody who grew up in or is already part of another religion, but yoga is part of your spirituality and getting closer to your own God. Ishvara Pranidhanaha. That is a word that I hope I did not butcher the Sanskrit of. It means devotion or a yearning to be closer to God. Some teachers also call Ishvana Pranidaha a non-attachment or letting go of ego. But what is important to know is what is it good to be attached to and what is an unhealthy attachment. Personally, I don't think being attached to your family is necessarily a bad thing, but if those attachments become unhealthy and maybe there's too much attachment going on, that could be unhealthy. If the attachment is only ego-based, it is therefore not healthy. So this is what Ishvana Pranidaha teaches us. Limb number 3 is asana. And asana's direct translation from the Sanskrit is seat. So why is it when somebody's teaching your class in English, they will finish the translation with pose at the end? Well, if I was teaching you a class and I said, please come to standing wide-legged forward fold seat, that might cause some confusion. And that connotation of seat only being a seat, sitting seat, doesn't come into the Sanskrit again. So that might be language dependent. I know especially in English it's there. I don't know any other languages well enough to say, or to be fluent language. Now, asana comes before breath and meditation in the limbs or the spokes of our wheel of yoga. And interestingly enough, historically, yoga gurus, when they ask their students to go and spread yoga to the West, ask them to start with yoga asana and not the other limbs. And I think they were very smart in doing that, because for many people, they find meditation very difficult unless they've been active before, unless they've done a tiring yoga practice. So it gets the nervous jitters out of their body. But traditionally speaking, our gurus, our teachers, the people we learned from, they would meditate for hours on end, and their bodies needed to be strong to do that. So if you look at it that way, the purpose of yoga asana was actually to be strong enough to sit, be still, practice pranayama and meditation for hours on end. And that got them closer to their connection with God. Limb number 4 is pranayama. Now, that translates as controlled intake and outflow of breath. but we know it as breathing techniques. And I want to pause here because breathing techniques, or what some teachers call breath retention, is not the same as breath work. A lot of breath work does take its teachings from yogic pranayama, but breath work generally has a larger focus on hyperventilating as a way to control the nervous system. Whereas pranayama, while there are some hyperventilation breaths like kapalabhati or skull shining, most of the breaths are actually about slowing down the breath count, the heartbeat, and in that way, even though they didn't have the language we use now, the gurus knew we were calming down our nervous system. Now, personally, I have used breath retention as a translation for pranayama before, but I no longer like it because there are 4 different parts to the breath in yogic philosophy. And one of those is retention at the top and the bottom of each breath. Now, our pranayamas in the yogic sense include our normal yogic belly breath, in and out of the belly, equal breath in, equal breath out. It includes ujjayi breath, it includes nadi shohana, box breath, and kapalabhati or skull shining. Each of our pranayama helps a different part of the body, well, maybe not part of the body, but help our body's systems in a different way. That's a much better way to put it. And this means it's very important to know contraindications. For instance, if somebody has severe anxiety, I would not suggest any breaths that hyperventilate. If somebody has depression and it's quite severe, not just your general run-of-the-mill depression, then I wouldn't want to have them doing breath counts that are too slow. One last translation that I quite like for pranayama is mastery of life force through breath control. Now, what's interesting is prana translates as breath, but it also translates as life force. So when your breath leaves your body, you no longer have life force. Breath is life. Our 5th limb is pratyahara, or sense withdrawal, and this can be experienced through meditation. When people get particularly good at meditation, they can go into a state where they draw inward so much so that they no longer feel a physical sense of touch, they no longer notice smell, taste, sight, or sound around them. No senses, just pure being. The next of our 8 limbs of yoga is dharana, which one translation is concentration. And I think for a lot of people, there's also a translation of meditation. Now, when we're meditating, we are trying to concentrate. We're trying to have 2, maybe just 1 focal points, whether that is the breath. I very often like a sense meditation to start at least, and then switching to breath. But for some of us, we need things like, me personally, I need to be breathing and counting the breath. So concentrating on just singular or 1 or 2 points really helps with this concentration, and it is vital to the practice. Limb number 7 is dhyana, and this is to become one in body, breath, and mind. So this is when you would no longer notice your body and breath without having to withdraw from the senses. And in the lineage of Vinyasa Yoga that I've studied from, this would be considered meditation. That leaves us with one last limb of yoga, and the 8th limb of yoga is samadhi. Samadhi is a state of enlightenment. It is pure consciousness. It is eternal bliss. And personally, I haven't reached that state. I don't personally know anyone who has, but I have read the writings of yogis who have, and I use the term yogis with the highest exaltation. It's not just anybody who practices yoga, it is somebody who from a guru is given the title of yogi. How do we get there? Well, we practice yoga, maybe until we become yoga. But those are all the 8 limbs. Like I say, we should be trying to practice all of them constantly, which is really difficult and takes a lot of consideration and thought. But if we start on the mat and bring what we learn on the mat and in our meditation and in our pranayama into our everyday life, maybe we can practice them all at once, non-stop. Thank you so much if you've made it to the end. Well done. I hope you enjoyed that. I would love to see you again if you subscribe to make sure that happens. If you have any thoughts or questions, please comment below, and a like or a share would help me more than you know. As always, thank you for allowing me to guide you through your practice.